Appeasement. You hear that word thrown around all the time in politics, right? And it's almost always an insult. It means you're weak, you're a coward, you're failing to stand up to a bully. But the real story, the story of the most famous act of appeasement in history, well, it's way more complicated and honestly, way more controversial than you probably think. So let's get into it and try to unravel this thing, the Appeasement Paradox.
So picture this, it's September 1938. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, gets off a plane after this super tense meeting with Adolf Hitler in Munich. And he's waving this piece of paper, and he's not met with angry protests, he's met with cheering crowds. People are ecstatic, the newspapers are calling him a hero. For that one brief moment, he was the man who saved the world from war.
So here's the big question, right? If he was celebrated for bringing home peace, how on earth did Neville Chamberlain become the poster boy for political failure? How did that moment of absolute triumph become this permanent stain on our history? Well, that is the Appeasement Paradox. To really get it, we have to go back to that moment, to the Munich Agreement of 1938. The entire world was basically holding its breath, convinced that another horrific, world-ending war was literally just days away. So, the deal was this. Britain and France agreed to let Germany just take the Sudetenland. It was a border region of Czechoslovakia that had a lot of ethnic Germans. And in return for this pretty huge concession, Hitler promised he was done. No more territorial demands in Europe. I mean, yeah, it was a massive giveaway, but the alternative looked like an all-out war.
Now, it is so easy for us, looking back, to just yell at the history books, right? Don't do it! You can't trust the guy! But Chamberlain and the other leaders back then, they weren't operating in a bubble. The pressure they were under was, well, it was almost unimaginable.
And that really gets to the heart of it. If giving in to a dictator was so clearly the wrong move, why in the world did they do it? And the answer isn't simple. It's not because they were stupid or because they were cowards. It's way more complex. Okay, just look at this list. It paints a picture of a perfect storm of crises. First, the memory of World War I. I mean, millions dead. That trauma was still incredibly fresh. Then you've got the Great Depression, which just wrecked economies worldwide. Britain simply couldn't afford to ramp up for a massive war. Plus, a lot of people, even in Britain, kind of thought the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh on Germany. So some of Hitler's early demands didn't seem totally out of line. And you can just keep adding to the pile. A massive empire that was getting too expensive to run, an America that wanted nothing to do with Europe's problems, and a fear of Stalin's communism that for many was actually bigger than their fear of Hitler's Nazism. You can start to see just how impossible Chamberlain's position really was. And another thing you absolutely have to remember is that appeasement wasn't just one single decision made on a Tuesday. It was a policy that played out over years. It was a response to Hitler constantly pushing the line, making another demand, and then promising, okay, this is the last one, I swear. Let's just walk through this step by step. In 1933, Germany starts rearming. Big violation of the treaty, but nobody does anything. Then in 1936, Hitler marches his troops back into the Rhineland. Again, nothing. Some even said he was just walking into his own backyard. Then comes March 1938, he annexes Austria. Another gamble, and it pays off. Every time he gets away with something, it just makes him bolder for the next move. Munich in September of 1938 was really the peak of this whole policy. But then, just 6 months later, he breaks his promise and invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. And that was the moment appeasement truly died. The invasion of Poland was just the final nail in the coffin. So now that we've seen how this all played out, let's just pause for a second and make sure we're all on the same page with this word. Appeasement, at its core, is just a policy of giving an aggressive power what they want to avoid a fight. And here's the thing. At the time, it wasn't a dirty word. People saw it as smart, pragmatic diplomacy. And this slide just lays out the debate perfectly. Was Munich a sensible gamble, or was it a cowardly betrayal? On the one hand, supporters argued, look, it dealt with some of Germany's real complaints from Versailles. And maybe most importantly, it bought Britain precious time to rearm for a war they knew they weren't ready to fight. But on the other hand, critics like Winston Churchill were shouting from the rooftops that this was a moral disaster, that it threw Czechoslovakia under the bus, that it showed Hitler that bullying works, and that it was all based on a total misread of what the man actually wanted, which was everything.
Okay, but here's where the story gets really interesting, I think. Our view today, that appeasement is just obviously 100% a bad thing, that wasn't always the case. Not even close. The verdict of history has actually flipped back and forth dramatically over the years, constantly being rewritten by whatever came next. This table tells such an incredible story. In 38, like we said, Chamberlain's a hero. He saved the peace. But by 1940, with the war going terribly, he's a villain, a scapegoat, one of the guilty men. Then, after the war, Churchill writes his famous memoirs and kind of cements the view that it was a noble but naive mistake. But wait, in the 60s, new government documents are released showing just how weak Britain actually was militarily and economically, and the verdict shifts again to, well, maybe he had no other choice. And today, the view is a lot more nuanced. A flawed leader, for sure, who made big mistakes, but who is also dealing with a truly impossible situation. It just goes to show you that history isn't set in stone. We're always rewriting it.
And speaking of rewriting history, you cannot overestimate the power of this man in shaping this entire story. Churchill's post-war book, The Gathering Storm, was a global bestseller. It basically defined how an entire generation understood what happened. He was a master storyteller, and he framed himself as the lone voice of reason, the prophet whose warnings were ignored. And for decades, his version was the version.
So, why are we talking about all this now? Why does any of it matter? Because the ghost of Munich has been haunting Western foreign policy ever since. That fear, the fear of being called an appeaser, has become this incredibly powerful force shaping conflicts for decades.
Because the simple, popular lesson that everyone took from 1938 was this: you can't negotiate with dictators. You have to use force, and you have to do it early, before they get too strong. And that one idea has become one of the most powerful arguments for going to war, over and over again.
And once you start looking for it, you see this echo everywhere. In 1956, the British Prime Minister explicitly called Egypt's President Nasser the next Hitler to justify the Suez invasion. In 1982, during the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher was apparently urged to negotiate, and she slammed the table, saying this was the table at which Neville Chamberlain sat. And of course, in 2003, both Tony Blair and George W. Bush repeatedly brought up the failure to stop Hitler as a major reason for invading Iraq. The ghost of Munich, it really is everywhere. Which brings us to the impossible question that leaders are still wrestling with today. How do you know the difference? At what exact point does trying to prevent a war through negotiation, which we call diplomacy, cross the line and become dangerously empowering a bully, which we call appeasement? The story of 1938 doesn't give us an easy answer. It just shows us the absolutely catastrophic price of getting it wrong.